One of the things I hear consistently from practices over and over again is nothing that we use as far as technology or software talks to each other. So whether that's your scheduling software or your electronic health or medical record software or billing software, all of those different things. Typically, when this happens, it's because you have multiple entry points for information that are coming into your system. And it can be really frustrating, especially for your team that is responsible for inputting that information, because there's no real way to track what's coming in one place and whether or not it's getting put into another place. So that ends up leading to duplicate information or missing information. In either way, shape, or form, this does nothing for your patient experience, and it actually causes more challenges than is necessary. But under all of that technology is a bigger problem. And that's what we're going to talk about today. If we haven't met yet, I'm Alisa Conner, and I show up here every week to help both specialty practices and professional service organizations grow, not by outspending their competitors, but instead by creating customer and patient experiences that your patients and customers just frankly can't wait to talk about. So let's dive into this week's topic and talk about the underlying challenge around technology disconnects. Now, oftentimes you'll have multiple different platforms that are serving your organization. You might have a medical billing software program, and you might have a scheduling software program, or you may be putting off getting a scheduling software program because it won't talk to your medical records program, or the medical records program you're using doesn't work well for scheduling. And there's a lot of hiccups here, but they can often be solved not necessarily by focusing on the technology first, but rather the systems underneath the technology. Let's walk through an example specifically of where this is showing up. So you have a referral that is sent to your office as an orthopedic surgeon. And someone is then responsible for adding that person into the system and taking in critical information and finding out where they are on the patient journey. So if by chance they are not ready to see a doctor, even though you know exactly which doctor they're going to see, they may need imaging or they may need to have an insurance authorization, but something is stopping the process. So if that patient then needs to be, say, sent for imaging, someone needs to remember to follow up with that patient. And so you have Susie at the front desk who follows up a couple weeks later to see if the imaging was done, where it is, because she hasn't heard anything from the imaging specialist. Or she has the imaging and she hasn't heard from the patient. So she leaves a message on their voicemail because she doesn't reach them. And then she has to remind herself to call again in some way, shape, or form, whether that's a sticky note or a spreadsheet, or she puts it in whatever software that the practice is using. Well, in the meantime, the patient calls back and Susie's not there. She's on vacation, she's at lunch, she's out sick that day, whatever. The patient doesn't remember who called them. And so now the person that's answering the phone has to try and figure out where that patient is. Because even though there are multiple different technology systems in place, the underlying process isn't written down, or Susie hasn't told anyone the way that she's tracking those patients and following up with them, or where that patient is in the process. And when I was doing research for this episode, I found a 2024 study. When I was researching for this episode, I ran across a research study that was done by the Journal of General Internal Medicine, where they looked at close to 400 practices and over 200,000 physicians to see how long they were spending in their electronic health records outside of seeing patients. And what the study found was that physicians average almost 6 hours of actively working in their health record management system for every 8 hours of scheduled patient care. So it's almost equal. They're almost spending the same amount of time with patients as they are with the documentation in their electronic record system. About 42% of that time happened outside of clinic hours and or on days that physicians weren't scheduled to see patients. So one of the things that we might be asking is that if they're spending all of this time outside of seeing patients just working on paperwork, I don't think that the EHR is the problem. Rather, we should be asking better questions. And the question that should be asked is, why do we keep automating tasks that don't have a good process beneath them? And that's really what I want to dive into in today's episode, is that we keep adding technology to the systems, but a lot of the systems and processes are either outdated, are not optimized, or everyone's not on the same ship. And so one piece of software sends people this way, another one sends people this way, or there's overlap, or there's duplications, or things are missing. And what that does, not only for the patient journey, is make it very challenging and not smooth, but it's also forcing physicians to take on additional roles where they could be seeing patients and doing the things that they actually enjoy doing instead of repeating paperwork that should follow the same system and be smooth and optimized. And right now it isn't, because you have patchwork technology and you don't have any systems or processes that have either been updated or challenged or that are written down and optimized so that everybody knows what goes where. So even if you have different technology, nobody's on board with how things should actually operate. Where I see this happening the most is with practices who are ready to jump into AI. And let's face it, AI is everywhere. And I think people are starting to find out the gig is up, that AI is not all that in a bag of chips. I'm not saying that AI can't be used effectively for some things, but if you don't have a way to direct AI or a process to give it to begin with, you're not going to see much success in having it fix your organization. And one of the reasons that AI can't do that for you is because it's not asking a critical question, which is, once this thing happens, for example, a patient reminder is sent, then what happens next? Because AI really doesn't have a logical brain. It's only going to spit out the things that it has been fed. And so it doesn't know your process. It doesn't know what happens next with the patient. It doesn't know where the patient is in the process, and it never will. So when you look at automating across your organization and you don't look at the foundation first, you are just adding one more band-aid to a list of band-aids that already exist. A perfect example of this is online scheduling. Now, I've looked at probably 200 practices in the last 3 to 4 months just to see what challenges are showing up with online scheduling. And they fall into 3 different categories. You have practices who have not jumped on to online scheduling at all. They're still doing a contact form or expecting people to call by phone. They're definitely losing out on patients. And then you have people that have started to swim in the shallow end with online scheduling, but haven't thought through the patient journey and are definitely losing people because they are either asking for too much information or they're not giving the patients the information that they're looking for when they want to schedule. For example, the physician that they would be scheduling with, or the appointment and time and date before they're asking for 35 pieces of information. Or you have the people that have thought through all of it and theirs is running smoothly, but then they never review what's going on with that online scheduling to see if things need to be optimized, if everything's working well, or if the calendars are actually filling, and if they aren't, why. So there's 3 different parties you could be attending. You choose which one you're on right now with your practice. Regardless, each of those 3 buckets that people are falling into need to be reviewed and need to ensure that your team and people that are responsible for every part of that patient journey are on board and are informed about what the process is. A perfect example of this that I have run into is you may have online scheduling and it works fantastic. The patient can pick their date and time. They know what doctor they're going to. They're getting reminders. Something happens. They need to reschedule or they need to cancel. And it could be for any variety of things. They have the flu, they have COVID. Well, there's no way for them to cancel or reschedule that appointment without calling the office. The last thing somebody wants to do when they don't feel well is call and wait on hold for a doctor's office to answer in order to reschedule or cancel their appointment. That is not looking at the process from the patient's point of view. The tool for online scheduling worked perfectly. They were able to get their appointment scheduled, but then when it came to making it fit with their lifestyle, because they didn't even know that they were going to have to call until 8:30 at night, and now the office isn't open. They have to get up early in the morning when they don't feel well and wait for the office to open to tell them they can't come that day. That's not good patient experience. While we're on the topic of online scheduling, because I've looked at this a lot, most online scheduling was built from one or two perspectives. The first being the technology provider. They're looking at it from how quickly can we gather information to get people put into a system and get their appointment booked. They want to gather as much information from the patient as possible and then get them an appointment. The second viewpoint is from the practice's viewpoint. We want to make sure that we only have a certain number of appointments available per physician. We don't want to have them come in at certain times. If they're a new patient, they get these kinds of appointments in this amount of time. If they're a previous patient, they would get this type of appointment time and time allotment. But nobody's looking at this from the patient perspective. And one of the biggest challenges that I see with online scheduling is asking for too much information up front. Now, you have to look at this from the patient perspective. If you took a step back and you were the person scheduling this appointment, and all you wanted to know was the date and the times available for the physician that you want to see, or for the multiple physicians that could help you with whatever you have going on. We're going to use ankle pain for an example. You have 3 or 4 physicians with ankle pain. They may know Dr. Jones is who they want to see because their friend Joe told them that that is who they went to and they're the best at what they do. If that's the case, that they already know they want to book with that doctor, but then they go to the website and you've asked them for 13 to 15 to 17 pieces of information before you even show them an appointment time, they're gone. And this is based on research. Every time you ask for additional information after the first 2 fields, the rate of completion drops by 20%. So if you're asking for 3, 20%. If you're asking for 4, 20 more percent. To the point where once you get to a certain number of questions, they just leave and go somewhere else. I've gone through the process dozens and dozens of times already. And I can tell you from the outside in and what your patients are experiencing is frustration and annoyance because you want them to give you what is possibly the most expensive collateral that we have as individuals right now, which is personal information, before you've ever even given them a reason to do that. So I would challenge you to go look at your own scheduling software and see how easy it is for you to pick a date and time for someone to book with you. If it's more than a couple of seconds for them to find a time and date, you know that you have a challenge. The second place that I see this going wrong is with people that say schedule here and their practice has no online scheduling. Where they send people is to a form. And the likelihood that people will fill out a contact form on your website is slim to none at this point in the game. The latest research I have read about patient preferences is that over 92% of patients, regardless of age, want to be able to schedule, cancel, change, reschedule their appointments online. And if you make this challenging and you want them to fill out a form or call a phone number, you are losing patients. I can guarantee it because your competitor down the street not only offers all of those options, but they likely offer a chat and text option as well. The other place that I see practices specifically who are looking at marketing as the voice of reason for growing their practice are challenged is when they're running advertising. And typically you see advertising for practices either on Facebook or Instagram or both. And there's a reason behind that. And that is because when marketing on those platforms, it's still the most cost-effective mechanism to promote a business. The challenge becomes when you're running an ad and the link for that ad says something like schedule an appointment, but then it sends the person from the ad platform to a generic page. And there's no button to schedule. they are featuring a specific injury or doctor, and then that button for the ad just goes to some random page instead of the ability for them to click on a button and actually schedule. This is one, very frustrating for the patient because they're thinking, hey, I really like that doctor. And now I have to go and find that ad because it opened it in another tab to their website, or it opened it directly to their website and I can't find where I was. Or the ad is talking about a specific challenge that they're having, like knee pain. And when it sends them to a general page, they're wondering, where can I get treated for my knee pain? Because it's going to a generic page for all of the ailments that you treat. And so they're not going to go on a scavenger hunt to find what they thought they were going to. And the other part of this that is the underlying challenge is that you have already started to break trust with them. And you likely don't even realize it because you've asked them to click on something. They took the initiative to do that. And now you're sending them off to some random page on your website that isn't getting them closer to the result that you promised in the ad. That trust is much harder to regain or build, especially after you've disappointed someone. In all of these cases, the technology works. It does what that it promised it would do. What it did not do is look at it from the perspective of the people who were actually using the technology the most. It's looking at it from a perspective of the people who are using it for themselves. The technology was designed to collect as much information up front so that the office wouldn't have to worry about it later. I'm not saying you shouldn't collect that information, but you should think about the way that a person who doesn't know you yet, who's booking an appointment, goes through the process. Because if you're asking them for everything under the sun before you give them what they came for, they're not going to stay around and try to figure out how much information you're actually asking them to give you before they move on to someone else. We talked a little bit about information as currency, but the other component that is currency that not only practices, but businesses as a whole don't take into consideration is time. Time is likely an even higher currency than information or data, personal information or data. And the reason behind that is that you can't create more of it. And so when you waste someone's time by sending them on a scavenger hunt on your website or making them fill out a bunch of information before they even know if an appointment time is going to work for them, they aren't likely to forgive or forget that interruption or that you've stolen that time from them. In fact, it's likely building a negative experience in their mind that you're going to have to compensate for with even better patient experience when they show up in your office. But if you don't know that and you're not aware of that, the scales are already tipping out of your favor. This translates into the second area where patients and also your staff can experience friction, and hence your practice experiencing friction, and that's inhibiting your growth. So let's take, for example, that over the last 5 years, you've adopted 7 different pieces of technology for your practice. And running those different pieces of technology was supposed to save you not only time, but also save you money. In the meantime, you have 3 full-time people that are just in charge of maintaining that technology and keeping those systems coordinated, and they're not helping grow the practice or keeping things efficient or flowing easily because they rely on people behind the systems. I'm not saying you need to ditch all of the systems that you've already invested in, but a lot of times technology software organizations will sell you the stars and the moon and promise you the sky, only to walk out the door a year or a year and a half later and not solving the initial problem that they promised to help you solve. Every time you have a handoff in your office, you're causing friction. So whether that's because you have to enter a patient into the system multiple times, or multiple people have to put their part of a process into a separate system, there's not only the opportunity for there to be duplication or incorrect information, but there's also the chance that you're going to miss information. And I get it. Physicians and all of their team and staff are busy, so mistakes can easily be made. But when you have too many irons in the fire, the likelihood that mistakes are going to be made becomes even higher. So if you have 7 different systems that say 3 different people are in charge of, and then you have all of these different hands touching that system, every time that something has to be re-entered or put in a different place, there's a chance of disconnection. And that's not only causing chaos for your team and your staff, people not knowing where a patient stands, where things are, or where things are getting stuck, but it's leaving your patients in limbo. And that is the last thing you want to do, especially when you're trying to give them world-class experience. Some of that friction is reliant on the technology. Technology changes. If you're like most people, you probably upgrade your phone every 5 years or so, or maybe even more often. When you invest in a technology platform, you're hoping that it lasts longer than that. But oftentimes, because the world is changing so fast, those platforms change with it. And so you may have one system that was promised to work with another one, but then the system you bought in year 4 doesn't talk to the one you bought in year 1. So that's just causing people to have to do more work because the older technology isn't talking to the newer technology, or there's no way to connect the two. So yes, some of this can stem from technology, and there are some limitations with technology. But if you don't have a process underneath the technology and more than just a couple of people who understand what's happening with the technology and the process under the technology, you're going to run into trouble. And this is where the challenge happens, not only for physicians, but also their teams. It's what's leading to burnout. It's what's leading to turnover. And turnover is a whole nother challenge that affects practices, because if one of those 3 people that is in the know about your technology walks out the door, then you have to find someone who understands that role and all of the information that that person had in their head about how that technology was infiltrated and working in the practice. Oftentimes, that is not something that can be completed in a couple of weeks before that person moves on. And that sends everybody into a tailspin. And we are very aware of how this impacts the practice as a whole, because you have people leaving positions, you have the number of clicks on your website that your marketing team is measuring, but nobody's really looking at this from the perspective of the patient. And when we're looking at it from the perspective of the patient, your patients don't know whether or not your technology is talking to each other. They just assume that it is. When they schedule an appointment, they assume that the information that they're entering is going directly into your EHR. If it isn't, that again is another layer of frustration and friction for them. How many times have you had a patient book or schedule an appointment, and their assumption is I just put all this information in to book the appointment, and then they get the new patient paperwork and it's asking them to repeat everything. Nothing is copied over, nothing is transferred through, and that is taking more of their time and is not only frustrating to them, but also makes them wonder what is happening on the back end. If they don't have their act together to carry through the information I just put into the system, into this new patient paperwork, I have to wonder how smoothly the operation is actually running. And that also starts to eat away at the trust that you're trying to build with them, especially as a new patient. That simple disconnect is affecting revenue. Whether you want to believe it is or not, when people have to re-enter information and they don't understand that there's no connection between the scheduling software and the new patient software, they don't frankly care, because now you're wasting their time by having them re-enter it, and that increases the likelihood that they're not only going to cancel, but that they're going to cancel and move on to someone else who has their ducks in a row, frankly. The other place that I often see this showing up is with referrals. So say a primary care doctor sends their patient, Sally Sue, over to your office, and she starts to go through the process of trying to book an appointment with you. And she runs into frustration number 1. It's hard to find a time and a date to schedule the appointment. I have to put in way too much information. Then I get to the scheduling page and it just lists out all the doctors. And I don't know anything about the doctors. I don't know which one to pick. I can't remember the name of the one that my primary told me to look for. And so then she's frustrated and she just decides to move on to someone else that her friend, brother, cousin, sister recommended to her. There goes your referral. And if this happens enough times, that can add up to significant amounts of money for your practice. So if you're wondering why you're not growing, why your schedules aren't full, the challenge may not be your technology. The challenge may be that you haven't taken a look at how your practice is operating from a different perspective. And that perspective has to be from the patient side. Nearly every practice that I've looked at in the last 8 months is challenged in the area of patient experience. And that's just the reality of it because you're focused on medicine and it never occurred to you or anybody in your practice to look at this from the patient's point of view. They may get to the office and have a fantastic experience, but if you aren't getting them in the office and you aren't getting them to the doctor who's going to give them that experience or the team around that doctor who's going to give them that experience, they're never going to have that experience. And this isn't just for new patients or patients that are trying to schedule. If you have challenges within your practice that aren't being handled by someone in your organization, and it could be anything from somebody cancels their appointment and that appointment never gets filled by somebody on the wait list, or somebody who should have been able to come in but couldn't, or you don't have a system to follow up with people who are stuck in one part of the process and they get lost and fall through the cracks. All of that is revenue that is leaving your practice. When I look at practices, there are 9 different places that I see them leaking revenue. Most practices on a good day can tell me 2. And that's not, I don't say that lightly, and I don't say that to make anyone feel bad, but I am saying that because it's important, especially as the private practices are shrinking regularly, that we address those 9 areas. Because if you don't, it's going to be harder and harder for you to compete with the big guys. And that is my why. That is the reason I do the things I do. And the reason I show up here every week is because I want the private, smaller practices to win. When you look at all of the places that patients can fall through the cracks, it adds up quickly. It can affect hundreds or even thousands of patients. If you lost 1,000 patients a month in your practice, what does that mean for your revenue? Do the math. I always challenge you to look at the math. If just half of the 1,000 patients became patients instead of falling through the cracks, what would that do to your revenue? What would that do to your growth? And what would that growth empower you to do for your organization? If you take anything away from this episode today, I want it to be this one question. Instead of asking your team, what can we automate? What can we, give to AI to help us with? I implore you to ask the question, where and who are we using to connect the systems we already have? And what processes don't exist or need to exist or need to be fleshed out and made better before we even look at automating anything else? I always recommend that you take one patient, and it can be a made-up patient if you want, walk them through your entire system. See where they're getting stuck in the processes. See what happens when they get stuck. Who or what area is dropping the ball? Or is there something that needs to be flushed out and not done manually, or that you're not reliant on somebody in your practice, a specific person in your practice, to ensure that it's getting done? When you take that imaginary patient through that process, you're going to learn a lot about your practice, and it's going to give you the perspective from the outside in, which is often not the viewpoint that practices are operating from. You can ask yourself these 5 simple questions when you're going through that process. Where does information come in? Patient information specifically. Where does someone have to enter that information again? Do they have to repeat the information in multiple places? And if they do, is it just from the practice side, or is that happening also on the patient side? If that's happening in either of those places, document it. Who owns what happens next in the process? And this should be for every step of the process. What happens if a patient doesn't follow the process the way it's written? Because that happens often. You have somebody that books or schedules a patient and then they either don't show up or they cancel, but then nobody got it. Like, prepare for the unexpected is really the point of that question. Where are you preparing for what you're not expecting? And how can you learn to expect it so you are prepared? The last question is the most important one you can ask, which is, how do you know when the process is finished? Or is it finished? Because depending on what kind of practice you have, for example, if you're a dentist, the process isn't finished. Because even if people come in for a dental cleaning, during that visit, they should be booked for their next cleaning. But if they aren't, then is that where the process is ending, or does someone pick it up somewhere else? When you answer this question, it's going to give you a really perspective of where the process actually stopped and where you're likely dropping patients. If you tune in regularly to this show, you know every week I try to give you an action plan. It's usually 3 simple steps that you can take to start moving in the right direction, and this week is no different. So this week's action plan is for you to first audit the technology that your practice is using. Write down every single piece of software, who's in charge of it, what it's used for, and whether or not your practice is actually using it and if it's effective. And I recommend doing this in a spreadsheet because you're probably going to find that you're using a lot more technology than you think you are. This includes any kinds of apps, any kinds of technology that you're using for billing, for scheduling, anything that you're paying for monthly or that you have paid for that helps run your practice, and create an audit around it. And then step number 2 is to review the processes for your practice. And you can start in general with how a patient moves through your organization. That can be anything from whether or not you're running ads for marketing to when somebody comes through and starts scheduling. If you want to start with the scheduling because that's something that you can control and measure, I say start there and go all the way through until the process is finished. Document every single step, even if it's not detailed. If it's just general steps. And then when you're doing that review, write down who's in charge of that process right now. Whose shoulders at the end of the day does that process rely on? And if it's just one person, you might want to think that through a little further, which leads us to step number 3. And that is to focus on one specific part of that process, just one. It doesn't have to be the entire process. It's nice for you to document it so you can see where you're going, but choose one part of the process that you can take control over in the next 60 days and create an action plan to do that. Who's going to help you facilitate that? Who's currently taking care of the process? Where are things falling through the cracks? And what technology do you either need to streamline, get rid of, or understand better to help you be more effective in what you're doing? More often than not, it's not that the technology you've purchased and invested in and are using that is the challenge. It's doing what it said it would do. It's helping you track clinical records. It's helping patients schedule. It's helping you complete your billing. Unfortunately, what is happening is that the foundation that all of that technology is laid upon was either never fully developed or is non-existent. And it's really hard for technology to assist you when those processes and procedures are either outdated, not optimized, or don't exist. Before you invest in the next tool for your practice, or you jump into AI and hoping that it's going to save the day, I implore you to, 1, work through the action plan that I just went through above, and 2, look at what's already happening in your practice so that you're not just hoping and praying that the next best thing is going to help save the day. More often than not, you don't need new tools. You don't need to jump on the bandwagon for the next best thing. You don't need to go to your next conference and be sold into something that's going to save everything that's going on. What you need to do is review what is actually happening in your practice so that you can use the tools that you already have effectively, ensure that they're talking to each other, and eliminate all of the places in your processes and within your practice that are causing duplication or reentry. This is going to save not only the physician's time and energy and hopefully prevent burnout a little quicker, but it's also going to make your team happier because they're going to know everybody's on board in the same place and that things aren't getting lost or dropped in between. If you don't know where to start, because this can be an overwhelming process and often there's a lot of moving parts and there's not always one person in your organization that can focus on this, I can help you get started with the free 20-minute triage call that I've set aside for people who listen to the podcast. If you want to book that 20-minute call, the link for that call is not only in the show notes, it's in the podcast notes and also the blog article that accompanies this episode. In the meantime, thank you so much for sticking with me today. If you found value in this episode, I would love for you to share it with someone else who you also think will get value from it. In the meantime, I'll see you next week. Take care, stay well, see you soon.